the work that was done. Well, over the years, they started to run out of space in the Marietta Cemetery, and they decided, well, we're going to take up those graves. They're not actually men's graves. And we're going to take those up and actually bury men who had died during World War II and Korea. So those graves are now gone, except for two of them. You'll see grave 1077, grave 1079. There's no grave headboard for 1078. That was amputated arms and legs that they never did put another headstone over. So that's just continually how incredible the information is on this. I can't say enough about Chaplain Van Horn and the work he did. You take where he was, Marietta, Georgia, in 1866 and 1867, there was nobody that wanted to help him to do his job. Then there was no railroad yet. They destroyed all the railroad. The Yankees destroyed all the railroad. And then the town of Marietta was burned down. You can see in that 1870 photo that the town hadn't even been rebuilt in 1870. The pillars for the 3rd Cobb County Courthouse are still prominent in the photo, and the town square itself hadn't been rebuilt. Families were just coming back, so there was no resources to actually do this job. So the job that he did is even more incredible with the circumstances he had to go through. So it really makes the superintendent of Arlington National Cemetery really look pathetic that they misidentified 600 to 6,000 graves, buried them on top of each other. Urns, cremation urns are on top of each other. Headstones are placed in wrong grave sites. And then he said, I had no resources or staff. So when you think of Chaplain Van Horn and what he did, it's incredible. Chaplain Whipple, who actually assisted him for a little while, would write in his notebook, Chaplain Van Horn goes to every gravesite, kneels down and says a prayer, and he treats every single man as if he is his own son. We have more admiration for Chaplain Van Horn than we can speak of. So I'll tell you really how incredible the work is that he did during that time period. And I spent a lot of time up at the cemetery and doing the documentation, as you can see through the books. And I am your very low-tech entertainment. Everybody keeps telling me you need to put this all on a computer, but I'm the type of guy who I want to take everything with me and have it there when I'm going through the battlefield. And you know, I don't want to have to dig through a computer. I've got my books all set and lined up. Got to see the back of my pickup out there and what it's got.
But you would have a volunteer who would do that, and it should be recorded on microfiche or in the computer so that it will be there forever.
Yeah, and I do really need assistance in the computer end of things now because 2 years ago I got really sick and almost died twice from a really rare disease. And it actually destroyed 50% of my brain. 90% of the people that get this disease die. I'm only one of 3 people to survive this disease in the last 20 years. So computer stuff is way out of my range right now. So I like to really write everything down. So I enjoy life. Have a good time. But this is my, everybody says this is my purpose in life, is to continue to identify these men. And if you're in town on May 28th, come out to the National Cemetery at 3:30. We're going to actually identify 2 more men. One is Wilson Fields, 15th Iowa. He died in a hospital in East Point, and he was taken and buried right outside the hospital and brought to Marietta National Cemetery on October 12, 1867, with a group of 31 other men that were buried. They were going to identify him. And one that I'm really proud of. We're actually going to, in the research that I've done, many historians of the Atlanta campaign said that Sherman had no black troops with him. He didn't like them, and he didn't use them. Well, we proved that wrong. Sherman actually had the 116th, 110th, and 113th United States Colored Troops with him. And he also had regiments, white regiments, that had black troops with them, that enlisted on December 25th, 1863 in Pulaski, Tennessee. They enlisted as cooks and musicians. On May 19, 1864, Sherman gave an order that if the Army would go into a fight immediately the musicians and cooks would become stretcher bearers and take care of our wounded. Well, Austin Gilmore, who had enlisted in December of '63 in 111, Illinois, he was a slave with the Gilmore family just outside of Pulaski, Tennessee. On June 27, 1864, he took over the task to become a stretcher bearer. He made multiple trips. If you're familiar with the Kennesaw Mountain Battlefield, right where Burnt Hickory Road and Old Mountain Road meet, you go right up to the base of Pigeon Hill, the 111th, 116th Illinois, attacked right in there and was cut to pieces. Austin Gilmore made multiple trips across the open field and retrieved wounded Union soldiers and took them back to the field hospital that was about 3/4 of a mile to a mile down Burnt Hickory Road towards the west. On one of those trips, he was wounded in the right hip, taken back to the field hospital, eventually taken up to Rome, Georgia, and he would die of his wounds on July 1st, 1864. He was buried in the Rome, Georgia cemetery for Union soldiers 1/4 of a mile west of the river, 150 yards east of the church. That's how in depth this stuff gets. He was only one of 2 men of color that were died in that hospital was buried there. One of them was actually identified as Henry Bass with the 12th aisle. He had the same situation. He died of a disease that and was up there, but he was identified. Austin Gilmore ended up in an unknown grave, and then he ended up being buried in Marietta National Cemetery. In Section F of my books, it's all dedicated to the area of mainly the fights at Jonesboro and Peachtree Creek, but also all the men that was with Sherman's army of color, men of African descent and slaves, were all buried in Section F, all right together, in 4 rows on the southeast corner of Section F. Now, when I first started going into the cemetery and seeing all these documents of USCT troops, colored, all in that area, all buried the same together, I thought, wow, Chaplain Van Horn put these men together because they were black. That's why he did it. But then, through in-depth research, I found out that all the men that died with Sherman in 1864 are buried right next to each other, shoulder to shoulder. All the men who enlisted with 136 United States colored troops on July 25th, 1865, when they died in the hospitals in Augusta or accidents in their service for 6 months, they are all buried right next to each other in the next row towards the road. And the same with the 138 United States colored troops. These men were slaves around the Atlanta area and would enlist for just briefly 6 months, and they lost 45 men, all by disease, and a smallpox epidemic that kicked in, and they died in Augusta. They were all buried right next to each other. You can walk that Section F, and you can even walk the entire Marietta National Cemetery, and you can tell American history throughout it. We've got 2 men that fought in the Revolutionary War, John Clark, and he would be governor of Georgia in 1818 and 1821, and John Hams, who was from South Carolina, he ended up settling in Washington, Georgia. And then you have somebody from every single war that is buried in Marietta. And in 2004, we actually had a Marietta resident. Jeffrey Blanton was killed in Iraq, and he was a 2 sports athlete. He graduated from Marietta High School. So his family wanted him buried in Marietta, and the superintendent opened the cemetery back up so that he could be buried there. Can you tell where I spend all my time? Yes, sir.
Have you said how large the cemetery is and how many graves there are?
18,838 right
Graves.
now.
Graves.
Yeah. Now, that's not total burials, because you have spouses are buried in the same grave now. The husband and wife are buried in the same grave. They used to be buried right next to each other. You know, the service man or woman, and then the spouse would be buried next to each other. And then they came up with a new regulation with the VA, because they were running out of land, that they would stack. So the first one to die would go 8 feet down in their casket, and then the next one to die would be buried on top. And that so it would save land, essentially. The veteran's name is on the front of the headboard, the spouse's is on the back. Now, I had to tell you a funny story. I was giving a tour to the 4th Infantry Division's reunion association in Marietta. And we had a blast. So they said, well, Brian, we want you to come to our formal banquet. So I came out, and they were all dressed up and had their pins on and medals, and we're sitting there, and the staff had just delivered hot cups of coffee. And the president of the Reunion Association got up, and he said, well, I have news for you. From now on, instead of being side by side, spouse and veteran, we're going to have a stacking situation. The VA has come up with this new rule. First one to die goes in first, the next one to go on top. Well, this guy was feeling pretty perky. This veteran was feeling really perky. His wife was sitting next to him. He stood up and said, well, if I die first, I want to be buried face down because I don't want to spend eternity looking up at her. Bad idea when there's a cup of coffee going. She threw that cup of coffee right in his lap. And the men were laughing so hard, said he hadn't moved that fast since we were in Saigon. And that's a true story, by the way. But so far, with the research and Chaplain Van Horn's records and 30 trips to the archives in D.C., and I've been able to identify 45 with May 28th's release in their names. Just kind of one of those things where I don't feel as empty when I try to find my great-great-grandfather's grave now. At least I'm able to do something to honor these men and maybe earn their sacrifice. Questions? I'll take any questions.
Are the graves down at Andersonville that well documented?
Oh, they're incredible. Doran Satwater, who was with the New York Regiment, he was captured and placed at Andersonville. And very early on, he started to realize the conditions and that we were going to have a lot of deaths. So he volunteered to be a hospital steward. And he would document every soldier in his notebooks, in these books he had, one right after the other. And he actually made 2 copies because he was afraid that as the war was going to end, the Confederates wouldn't want everybody to know what happened down there. So he kept 2 copies, and because of his work, his incredible dedication, there are 12,948 Union soldiers buried at Andersonville in 14 months of operation. Only 700 and change are unknown. And we don't know why, whether Doran Satwater got sick or he might have been out on a work crew or something and those deaths didn't get reported. But because of his great work, we don't have that. If you go to Salisbury, where there was a prison camp there, you walk into the cemetery site, there's one marble headstone that says unknown U.S. soldiers, and it has a number. And you walk to the next slit trench, and it has a number. Exactly throughout that. You go to Florence, South Carolina Cemetery, where they have prison camp, it's the same way. You just never know who was buried. And these families, as you can imagine, when the war was over and their loved ones didn't come home, they never had the solace of at least knowing that incredible feeling of knowing what had happened to a father, a son, a husband, or a brother. So Doran Satwater is incredible. Yes, ma'am.
Brad, is it just Union soldiers that are buried over there in Marietta?
Oh, have I got a great story for you. This was just found out recently. The land was used when the hospitals in Marietta were used as Confederate hospitals, and then when Sherman came through, they were used as Union hospitals. Well, Henry Green Cole's land was actually used to bury soldiers who had died where the Marietta Library is today, the Roswell World Library. That was a field hospital for the Confederates. And they were buried on a hill right there on Henry Green Cole's land. And then Union soldiers that had died in hospitals were buried on the same land. There were 17 Confederate soldiers buried there, and then all the Union soldiers. Well, Chaplain Van Horn and his work crew on October 14th, 1866, took the 17 Confederate soldiers, took them down to Oakland Cemetery, and got 21 Union soldiers and brought them up to Marietta. And these Confederate soldiers are actually buried there today. So they thought that was all the Confederate soldiers. Well, out at near Ruff Station, which is just a little west of Marietta, a Confederate officer named Benjamin Franklin Dumas was captured. He got lost. He was captured, very sick, and he ended up dying in a campsite. And so these Union soldiers buried him, put up a headboard that said B.F. Dumas, 46, and they had written Tennessee. Well, they were buried in among Union soldiers. When Chaplain Van Horn's crew came through, they took him to the Marietta National Cemetery, thinking he was a Union officer. Buried him in the section for officers, in the middle of every section of the cemetery. And nobody ever knew it until I started doing some research in 46, Tennessee. That didn't go high enough for a Union regiment. So I did some research and kind of found out, well, simultaneously, the family had done research and finally found, they searched for him for many years in the Confederate cemetery, thinking he was an unknown. And then by chance, they were in the Marietta National Cemetery on Memorial Day. They were turning the pages, and it popped up, B.F. Dumas. And it proved it was their ancestor, Confederate Lieutenant Benjamin Franklin Dumas. So he's buried in Marietta National Cemetery. And for a long time, we had heard the family wants him removed from the Marietta National and taken over to the Confederate Cemetery. Now they've kind of backed off, and we really don't know what they want. So we're kind of waiting on them to make a decision. But if it happens, I mean, it would be cool here in the 150th anniversaries to actually have